Sarah Martinez had always preferred the corners of rooms. At 22, she had mastered the art of becoming invisible, slipping through crowds like water through fingers. Her dark hair fell in loose waves around her shoulders, often serving as a curtain between herself and the world. She wore simple clothes, nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention. To most people, she was just another quiet girl trying to make her way through life. The military recruitment center in downtown Phoenix buzzed with nervous energy on that sweltering Tuesday morning in July. Young men and women filled the waiting area, some fidgeting with paperwork, others staring at their phones to calm their nerves. Sarah sat in the far corner, her recruitment packet balanced on her knees, her pen moving steadily across the forms. She had arrived early, as she always did, hoping to complete her business and leave before the crowds grew too thick. 9 recruits had gathered near the front desk, their voices carrying across the room with the kind of bravado that often masked uncertainty. They were all young men, ranging from 18 to 24, each trying to project an image of toughness and confidence. Marcus Thompson, a tall kid from the suburbs with perfectly styled hair, seemed to be their unofficial leader. He had played football in high school and carried himself with the swagger of someone who had never truly been challenged. "Look at all these wannabes," Marcus said, loud enough for half the room to hear. His friends chuckled, feeding off his energy. "Half these people won't make it through basic training." Jake Williams, shorter but stockier, with arms covered in amateur tattoos from his neighborhood shop, nodded in agreement. "Yeah, especially the girls. What are they even doing here?" Sarah kept her head down, her pen continuing to move across the forms. She had heard similar comments countless times throughout her life. In high school, classmates had dismissed her as weak because she didn't speak up in class. In her part-time jobs, coworkers had assumed she lacked ambition because she didn't compete for attention. The world had taught her that being quiet meant being overlooked, and being overlooked often meant being safe. But safety had never been Sarah's primary concern. The 9 recruits had noticed her, as groups like this always seem to notice the solitary figures in any room. They whispered among themselves, occasionally glancing in her direction. Sarah could feel their attention like a weight pressing down on her shoulders. But she continued filling out her forms with practiced calm. "Check out the mouse in the corner," said Devin Brooks, a lanky kid with nervous energy who seemed desperate to fit in with the others. "Looks like she's afraid of her own shadow. Probably thinks this is summer camp," added Carlos Mendez, whose own nervousness made him speak louder than necessary. "Wait until she finds out what real military training is like." The comments grew bolder as the morning progressed. What started as whispered observations evolved into direct commentary meant for Sarah's ears. They questioned her fitness level, her mental toughness, her reasons for being there. They wondered aloud if she understood what she was signing up for, if she had what it took to serve her country. Sarah had encountered bullies before, though never in such an organized fashion. These young men fed off each other's energy, each comment building on the last, each laugh encouraging the next jab. They seemed to view her as easy prey, a way to establish their own dominance in an environment where they felt uncertain about their place. The recruitment office staff bustled about their business, processing paperwork and conducting initial interviews. The noise level in the waiting area made individual conversations difficult to hear unless someone was specifically listening. The 9 recruits took advantage of this, gradually moving closer to Sarah's corner, their comments becoming more pointed. "Maybe she's here because her boyfriend dared her," suggested Tommy Rodriguez, whose own slight build made his aggressive posture seem almost comical. "Bet she'll change her mind once she sees what real soldiers look like." Sarah's pen paused for just a moment before continuing across the page. She had learned long ago that reactions only encouraged bullies. The best strategy was to become invisible, to give them nothing to feed on until they moved on to easier targets. But these young men were persistent. They formed a loose semicircle around her corner, not quite blocking her in, but making it clear she was the center of their attention. Marcus leaned against the wall nearest to her, his arms crossed in a display of casual dominance. "What's your name, quiet girl?" he asked, his voice carrying just enough false friendliness to make the question sound like a challenge. Sarah looked up for the first time, meeting his gaze briefly before returning to her paperwork. "Sarah," she said simply, Her voice so quiet several of the young men had to lean in to hear her. Sarah, Marcus repeated, as if testing how the name felt in his mouth. And what branch are you thinking about joining, Sarah? The Coast Guard? Maybe the Air Force where you can sit behind a desk. The others chuckled, emboldened by their leader's direct approach. Jake stepped closer, his own tattoos visible beneath his rolled-up sleeves. Come on, be honest. This is just a phase, right? You'll drop out of basic the first week. Sarah had faced moments like this before, though never with quite this many people or in such a public setting. Her hands remained steady as she continued filling out forms, but, inside, she was making calculations. 9 young men, all larger than her, all feeding off each other's aggression. The office staff was busy, and other recruits were either absorbed in their own paperwork or pretending not to notice what was happening. Maybe we're being too hard on her, said Alex Chun, though his tone suggested he was anything but sympathetic. I mean, the military needs people to cook and clean too. Or maybe she's here for the college money, added Ryan Walsh, whose own financial struggles had been the primary motivation for his recruitment. Easy way to pay for school without actually doing anything dangerous. The circle had tightened without Sarah fully realizing it. What had started as casual proximity had become something more deliberate, more intimidating. The 9 young men weren't quite touching her or blocking her path, but their presence felt overwhelming in the small corner space. Sarah finished the last line of her current form and reached for the next one in her packet. Her movements remained calm and methodical, but she was acutely aware of the energy surrounding her. These young men were working themselves up, feeding off each other's bravado and her apparent vulnerability. You know what I think? Marcus said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. I think you have no idea what you're getting into. Military service isn't a game. People die. People get hurt. This isn't a place for people who can't handle real pressure. For the first time, Sarah looked up and held his gaze. Her dark eyes were steady, unblinking, and something in them made Marcus take a half step back before he caught himself. I appreciate your concern, Sarah said, her voice still quiet but carrying a weight that none of them had expected. I'm sure you all have your own reasons for being here. The simple response somehow deflated some of the group's momentum. They had been expecting tears, arguments, or a hasty retreat. Instead, they got calm acknowledgement that left them uncertain how to proceed. But Devon, perhaps sensing the group's hesitation, pushed forward with renewed aggression. Concern? We're trying to save you from making a huge mistake. Look at you. You're tiny. You're scared. You probably can't even do a push-up. Maybe we should test that theory, suggested Tommy, his own insecurities driving him to escalate the situation. Come on, quiet girl. Show us what you've got. Drop and give us 10. The challenge hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Other recruits in the waiting area had begun to notice the commotion, though most seemed content to stay out of what appeared to be a brewing confrontation. The office staff remained busy with their official duties, unaware that the situation in the corner was rapidly approaching a tipping point. Sarah carefully placed her pen on top of her paperwork and looked around the circle of young men surrounding her. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes, something that made Jake unconsciously step back. But then, she simply returned to her forms, her expression neutral. I'm just here to complete my paperwork, she said quietly. Same as everyone else. The dismissal stung worse than any argument would have. Marcus felt his face flush with embarrassment and anger. Here he was, trying to assert dominance in front of his new military peers. And this quiet girl was treating him like an annoying child. Don't ignore us, he said, his voice rising enough to draw glances from across the room. We're trying to help you understand reality here. Yeah, added Carlos, emboldened by Marcus's escalation. The military isn't a place for people who can't stand up for themselves. If you can't handle a few questions from us, how are you going to handle enemy fire? Sarah's pen stopped moving. The form in front of her was nearly complete, just a few more signatures needed. But the atmosphere around her had shifted, becoming more aggressive, more threatening. She could feel the weight of their expectations, their desire for her to break down or fight back, to give them the reaction that would justify their behavior. Instead, she carefully capped her pen and placed it in her small purse. Then, she stood up, her movements slow and deliberate. The 9 young men instinctively shifted, expecting her to try to push through their circle or make some kind of dramatic exit. But Sarah didn't move toward the exit. Instead, she turned to face Marcus directly, her posture relaxed but somehow commanding attention. For a moment, the entire group fell silent, waiting to see what the quiet girl would do next. "You're right about one thing," Sarah said, her voice still quiet but carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "The military isn't a place for people who can't handle pressure." She reached up to the collar of her loose-fitting blouse and carefully folded it back, revealing the upper portion of her left shoulder. There, in sharp black ink against her pale skin, was the beginning of what was clearly a military tattoo. The partial image showed the distinctive trident and anchor, though the full design remained hidden beneath her clothing. The 9 recruits stared, their confident expressions beginning to falter as they tried to process what they were seeing. Military tattoos weren't uncommon among recruits, but there was something about the professional quality and placement of this one that suggested it wasn't the typical post-enlistment celebration piece. "What?" Marcus started to say, then stopped, uncertainty creeping into his voice for the first time. Sarah looked at each of them in turn, her calm demeanor unchanged despite the shift in dynamics around her. "You assume a lot about people based on very little information," she said. "That's probably something you'll want to work on." She straightened her collar, hiding the tattoo once again, and returned to her seat. But the atmosphere in the corner had changed completely. The 9 young men who had been so confident moments before now stood in uncomfortable silence, their bravado evaporating as they tried to understand what they had just witnessed. The waiting area continued to buzz with activity around them. Other recruits focused on their own paperwork and conversations. But in the small corner where Sarah sat, a tense quiet had settled over the group. The hunters had suddenly become uncertain whether they were still the predators in this situation. Sarah picked up her pen and returned to her forms as if nothing had happened. But the 9 recruits remained standing around her, no longer aggressive, but not quite ready to retreat either. They had started something, and now none of them knew how to finish it. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the recruitment center, casting long shadows across the room. In her corner, Sarah Martinez continued filling out paperwork with the same quiet efficiency she had shown since arriving. But everything had changed, and everyone in that small space knew it. The question now was what would happen next. The silence stretched for nearly a minute before Devin found his voice. "So you've got a military tattoo. Lots of people do. Doesn't mean anything." But his words lacked the conviction they had carried earlier. The others nodded along, though their posture had shifted noticeably. They no longer loomed over Sarah with the same aggressive confidence. Instead, they seemed to be studying her, trying to reconcile the quiet woman in front of them with the implications of what they had just seen. Jake crossed his arms, his own amateur tattoos suddenly, seeming childish in comparison to the professional work they had glimpsed on Sarah's shoulder. "My cousin's got Navy ink, and he never even left port. Tattoos don't prove anything." Sarah continued writing, seemingly absorbed in her paperwork. But she was listening to every word, measuring the tone and tenor of their voices. The aggression was still there, but it was mixed now with uncertainty and something that might have been respect, though they would never admit it. "Look," Marcus said, trying to regain control of the situation, "we're all here for the same reason. We want to serve our country. But that doesn't change the fact that some people are better suited for it than others." Sarah finished signing her name on the current form and looked up at him again. This time, her gaze held his for several seconds before she spoke. "What branch are you hoping for?" she asked, her tone conversational rather than confrontational. The unexpected question caught Marcus off guard. "Marines," he said automatically, then seemed to remember he was supposed to be intimidating her. "Why?" "Just curious," Sarah replied, returning to her paperwork. "It's a good choice." The simple approval somehow made Marcus feel both validated and confused. He had been expecting her to challenge him or make some comment about Marine stereotypes. Instead, she had given him exactly the kind of recognition he had been seeking, but without the context of fear or submission he had hoped to inspire. Tommy shifted uncomfortably. "What about you? What branch?" Sarah glanced up briefly. "We'll see what happens." "That's not an answer," Carlos said, though his voice lacked its earlier edge. Everyone here knows what they want. Navy, Army, Marines, Air Force. You can't just walk in here without a plan. For the first time since the conversation began, Sarah smiled slightly. It was a small expression, barely visible, but it changed her entire face. Suddenly, she looked less like a victim and more like someone who knew something the rest of them didn't. "You're right," she said. "Everyone should have a plan." Alex's chin had been hanging back, watching the interaction with growing unease. Unlike the others, he had noticed small details about Sarah that didn't fit the profile they had constructed for her. Her posture, even when sitting, suggested someone comfortable with physical activity. Her hands, when not holding a pen, rested in positions that spoke of training. Her eyes, when she looked up, scanned the room with the kind of systematic awareness that didn't come naturally. "You're military already, aren't you?" he said suddenly, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. The group turned to stare at him, then back at Sarah. She had gone very still, her pen hovering over the paper without writing. "What are you talking about?" Ryan demanded. "She's here filling out the same papers we are." But Alex pressed on, his mind racing as pieces fell into place. "No, look at her. Really look at her. The way she sits, the way she moves. And that tattoo wasn't some random design. That was military unit ink." Sarah set down her pen and folded her hands in her lap. For the first time since the confrontation began, she looked directly at all 9 young men, meeting each of their gazes in turn. "I served 5 years active duty," she said quietly. "I'm here today because I'm considering reserve status." The admission hit the group like a shockwave. Marcus felt his stomach drop as the implications became clear. Devin actually stepped backward, as if physical distance could somehow undo what he had been saying for the past hour. Jake's face flushed red with embarrassment. 5 years? Tommy asked weakly. "In what capacity?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. "Special operations." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Special operations meant elite training, dangerous missions, the kind of service that most of these young men could only dream about. It meant that while they had been playing high school sports and working part-time jobs, she had been serving in some of the most demanding roles the military had to offer. "Bullshit," Marcus said, but his voice cracked on the word. "You're making that up." Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out a small leather wallet. From it, she extracted what appeared to be a military identification card and a small photograph. She held them up briefly, just long enough for the group to see they were genuine, then returned them to her wallet. "I don't need to prove anything to you," she said calmly. "But I also don't need to sit here and listen to you question whether I belong in the same room as you." Carlos swallowed hard. "What kind of special operations?" Sarah looked at him for a long moment, as if measuring whether he deserved an answer. The kind where people don't ask questions. The response was both informative and completely unsatisfying. It told them that her service had been classified, dangerous, and probably involved the kind of operations they had only seen in movies. It also made it clear that she wasn't going to elaborate. Ryan tried to salvage the situation. "Look, we didn't know. If you had just said something from the beginning." "Said what?" Sarah interrupted, her voice still quiet, but carrying a new edge. "That I had already served while you were all still deciding what to do with your lives? That I had already proven myself in ways you can't imagine? Why would I need to justify my presence here to a group of strangers?" The question exposed the fundamental flaw in their behavior. They had assumed authority over her based on nothing more than gender stereotypes and her quiet demeanor. They had appointed themselves judges of her worthiness without any qualifications to make such judgments. Jake cleared his throat nervously. We thought. You thought I was weak," Sarah finished for him. "You thought I was scared. You thought I didn't belong here." She stood up again, and this time her movement had a different quality, more controlled and purposeful. "You were wrong on all counts." Devin tried to recover some dignity. "Well, how were we supposed to know? You don't exactly look like Special Forces." Sarah tilted her head slightly, studying him. "What exactly does Special Forces look like?" The question trapped him completely. Any answer would reveal the stereotypes and assumptions that had guided their behavior. If he described a typical Hollywood image of Special Forces operators, he would be admitting that he knew nothing about actual military service. If he tried to backtrack, he would be admitting that his entire approach had been wrong from the beginning. I don't know, he admitted finally. That's the first honest thing any of you have said this morning, Sarah replied. The group stood in awkward silence, each man grappling with the reality that they had just spent an hour harassing a combat veteran. The power dynamic in the corner had shifted so completely that none of them knew how to respond. Marcus made one last attempt to salvage his pride. Look, mistakes happen. We're all on the same side here. Sarah picked up her paperwork and stood, her forms nearly complete. No, she said quietly. We're not on the same side. You're on the side that judges people based on appearances and assumptions. I'm on the side that judges people based on their actions. She walked past them toward the front desk, her movement fluid and confident. As she passed Marcus, she stopped and looked up at him. A piece of advice, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. When you get to basic training, don't assume you know who the weak links are going to be. You'll often be surprised by who breaks and who doesn't. With that, she continued to the desk, leaving the 9 recruits standing in the empty corner, staring after her with a mixture of embarrassment, confusion, and dawning respect. At the front desk, Sarah handed her completed paperwork to the clerk, who reviewed it quickly and efficiently. Other recruits in the waiting area had noticed the commotion in the corner, but had been unable to hear most of the conversation. To them, it simply appeared that a quiet young woman had been talking with a group of male recruits before proceeding with her business. Everything looks good, Ms. Martinez, the clerk said, stamping several of the forms. Your experience certainly makes this process smoother. Have you given any thought to which reserve unit you'd prefer? Sarah nodded. I have some options in mind. When will I hear back? Within 2 weeks. Given your background, I don't anticipate any issues. As Sarah concluded her business at the front desk, the 9 young men remained clustered in the corner, their earlier bravado completely deflated. They spoke in hushed tones, trying to process what had just happened. Do you think she was telling the truth? Tommy asked quietly. Alex nodded grimly. Everything about her says military. I can't believe we didn't see it earlier. But she looks so. Devin started, then stopped, realizing that finishing the sentence would only dig the hole deeper. So what? Jake demanded. So normal? So quiet? So female? What exactly were you expecting? The question forced them to confront their own prejudices. They had created an image in their minds of what a military person should look like, and Sarah didn't fit that image. But their image had been wrong, based on movies and stereotypes rather than reality. Marcus watched Sarah shake hands with the clerk and head toward the exit. She didn't look back at them or acknowledge their presence in any way. To her, they had apparently ceased to exist the moment she walked away from their circle. We really screwed up, he said finally. Yeah, Ryan agreed. We did. Carlos shook his head in disgust, though whether it was directed at Sarah or at themselves wasn't clear. 5 years special ops, and we're sitting here telling her she doesn't belong. Maybe we should apologize, suggested Alex. But Sarah had already reached the door. She paused for a moment, her hand on the handle, and turned back toward the room. Her gaze swept across the waiting area, taking in the other recruits, the busy staff, and, finally, the group of 9 young men still standing in the corner. For just a moment, her eyes met Marcus's across the room. There was no anger in them, no triumph, no vindication. There was something worse than any of those emotions, complete indifference. She had already dismissed them as irrelevant to her life and her future. Then, she pushed through the door and was gone, leaving the 9 recruits to contemplate the morning's events and what they revealed about themselves. The recruitment center continued to buzz with activity around them. New recruits arrived, paperwork was processed, and the business of military enrollment went on as it did every day. But, in the corner where it had all started, 9 young men stood in uncomfortable silence, each one privately questioning everything they thought they knew about strength, courage, and what it meant to serve. The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, streaming through the windows at a different angle now. The shadows in the room had shifted, and so had everything else. What had begun as a display of dominance had become a lesson in humility, taught by someone who had never raised her voice or lifted a hand in anger. The quiet girl was gone, but the impact of her presence would linger long after the door had closed behind her. 3 weeks later, The Phoenix Military Processing Station buzzed with the controlled chaos of a new intake day. Dozens of recruits who had completed their paperwork and medical examinations were reporting for final processing before shipping out to various training locations across the country. Marcus Thompson stood in line with his duffel bag, wearing the civilian clothes he would soon trade for military uniforms. The excitement he had felt during his initial recruitment visit had been tempered by weeks of reflection on what had happened that morning in the recruitment center. The memory of the quiet girl and his group's behavior toward her had haunted him more than he cared to admit. He wasn't alone in his discomfort. 5 of the original 9 recruits were present for the same processing session, their paths having converged again through the military's administrative machinery. Jake Williams stood 2 positions behind him in line, while Devin Brooks, Alex Chun, and Tommy Rodriguez clustered near the far wall, all wearing the same expression of nervous anticipation mixed with barely concealed shame. The processing station operated with military efficiency. Recruits moved through various stations, completing final paperwork, receiving preliminary briefings, and preparing for transportation to their respective training facilities. The atmosphere was professional, focused, and completely different from the casual environment of the recruitment center. Thompson, Marcus J., called a staff sergeant from behind a processing desk. Marcus stepped forward, his paperwork in hand, trying to project the confidence that had seemed so natural 3 weeks earlier. "Yes, Sergeant," he replied, handing over his documents. The staff sergeant reviewed the paperwork with practiced efficiency, checking items off a list and stamping various forms. "Marine Corps, infantry training. You ship out to Paris Island this afternoon. Any questions about your assignment?" "No, Sergeant." "Good. Report to Station 7 for final medical clearance. Then, return here for transportation briefing." As Marcus moved through the processing stations, he found himself scanning the room for a familiar face. He told himself he was just curious, that he wanted to see if Sarah Martinez would be there. But, deeper down, he knew he was looking for a chance to apologize, to somehow make amends for behavior that had grown more embarrassing with each passing day. At Station 7, a Navy corpsman checked his medical records and conducted a brief physical examination. The process was routine, professional, and mercifully quick. As Marcus was preparing to leave, the corpsman made a casual comment that stopped him cold. "You know, we had another Marine through here earlier. Small woman, quiet. Most decorated recruit I've seen come through this station." Marcus's heart began to race. "Decorated?" The corpsman glanced around to make sure they weren't overheard, then leaned in conspiratorially. "Navy Cross, Bronze Star with V for Valor, Purple Heart. Special Operations background. Real deal, if you know what I mean." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. The Navy Cross was the Navy and Marine Corps' second highest decoration for valor in combat, awarded only for extraordinary heroism in action against enemy forces. The Bronze Star with V device indicated acts of heroism in combat situations. The Purple Heart meant she had been wounded in action. She's going Marine Corps too?" Marcus managed to ask. "Reserve status, but yeah, probably end up as an instructor somewhere, given her background. Someone like that doesn't just fade into the ranks." Marcus thanked the corpsman and left the station in a daze. The implications of what he had just learned were staggering. Sarah Martinez wasn't just a veteran with some special operations experience. She was a combat hero, someone who had risked her life for her country and been recognized at the highest levels for her service. He found Jake at the next station, completing his own processing. "Did you hear about the quiet girl?" Marcus whispered urgently. Jake looked confused. "What about her?" "She's here. Today. And she's got medals. Real medals. Navy Cross, Bronze Star, Purple Heart." Jake's face went pale. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious. We harassed a legitimate war hero." The news spread quickly among the 5 men from the recruitment center. By the time they had all completed their processing, they were clustered together again, though this time their energy was very different from that morning 3 weeks ago. "We have to find her," Devin said, his voice tight with anxiety. "We have to apologize." "What are we going to say?" Tommy asked. "Sorry we assumed you were weak when you were actually out getting shot at while serving your country?" Alex shook his head grimly. "There's nothing we can say that will fix this." But Marcus was already moving, scanning the processing area for any sign of Sarah. The space was large and crowded, with recruits, staff, and family members moving in all directions. Finding one person would be like locating a needle in a haystack. Then he saw her. Sarah stood near the far end of the processing area, talking quietly with a Marine Corps gunnery sergeant. Even from a distance, Marcus could see that the conversation was different from the routine processing he had experienced. The gunnery sergeant's posture suggested respect, even deference, as he spoke with her. "There," Marcus said, pointing across the room. Over by the Marine Corps desk. The 5 young men began moving in that direction, weaving through the crowd of processing recruits. As they got closer, they could hear fragments of the conversation. "Be working with new recruits at the School of Infantry," the gunnery sergeant was saying. "Your experience will be invaluable in preparing them for deployment." Sarah nodded, her expression serious. "I understand the responsibility, Gunny. I won't let the Corps down." "Ma'am, with all due respect, the Corps let you down if anything. What happened in Syria?" He paused, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Well, let's just say we're honored to have you back in any capacity." Marcus felt his stomach drop even further. Syria meant combat operations, real combat against real enemies. While he and his friends had been playing high school football and worrying about college applications, Sarah had been in active combat zones, facing dangers they couldn't even imagine. The gunnery sergeant concluded his briefing and shook Sarah's hand with obvious respect. "Welcome back to the Corps, Staff Sergeant Martinez." Staff Sergeant. She had been promoted to non-commissioned officer rank during her active duty service, another indication of the level of her accomplishment. As the gunnery sergeant walked away, Sarah turned and found herself facing the 5 young men who had been approaching. The recognition was instant and mutual. Sarah's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture, a subtle tension that suggested she remembered exactly who they were and what had transpired between them. Marcus stepped forward, his throat dry. "Staff Sergeant Martinez." Sarah nodded once, acknowledging the use of her rank. "What can I do for you?" The formal tone made it clear that she had no interest in casual conversation. She was waiting to see what they wanted, prepared to deal with them, and move on. "We wanted to apologize," Marcus said, the words coming out in a rush, "for what happened at the recruitment center. We were completely out of line." Sarah listened without expression as each of the 5 men offered their own versions of apologies. They stumbled over their words, trying to explain behavior that they now realized was inexcusable. They spoke of assumptions and stereotypes, of ignorance and misplaced aggression. When they finished, Sarah remained silent for a long moment, studying each of their faces. Finally, she spoke. "Do you know what the most important lesson is in combat?" she asked. The question caught them off guard. Marcus shook his head. "It's that your life depends on the people next to you, regardless of what they look like or how they sound or where they come from." Sarah continued. "In a firefight, the only thing that matters is whether someone has your back. Everything else is just noise." She adjusted the strap of her bag, preparing to leave. "You judge me based on appearance and assumptions. In combat, that kind of thinking gets people killed. Not just enemies, but your own people." Jake found his voice. "We understand that now. We just want you to know that we're sorry." Sarah looked at him for a moment, then nodded slightly. "I believe you are. The question is whether you'll remember this lesson when it really matters." She started to walk away, then paused and turned back. "You're all shipping out to different training programs. Some of you will make it through, some won't. Some will serve with distinction, others will struggle. But all of you will face moments when you have to choose between your assumptions and reality." Her gaze moved across their faces one final time. "Choose reality. Your life, and the lives of others, may depend on it." With that, she walked away, disappearing into the crowd of processing personnel and recruits. The 5 young men stood in silence, watching her go, each one grappling with the weight of her words and the magnitude of their earlier mistakes. Over the following months, as they progressed through their various training programs, each of them would carry the memory of that encounter. They would remember the quiet girl in the corner who turned out to be a decorated combat veteran. They would remember their assumptions and how wrong they had been. Marcus, struggling through the mental and physical challenges of Marine Corps infantry training, would think of Sarah when instructors spoke about the importance of unit cohesion and trust. He would remember her words about choosing reality over assumptions when he was paired with recruits who didn't fit his expectations of what a Marine should be. Jake, enduring the rigors of Army basic training, would recall the morning at the recruitment center whenever he was tempted to judge someone based on appearance rather than performance. The memory would make him a better soldier and a better leader. Devin, Alex, and Tommy, each in their own service branches, would carry similar lessons forward. They would remember the staff sergeant who could have destroyed them with a few well-chosen words, but instead chose to teach them something valuable about judgment, respect, and the true nature of strength. Years later, when they had completed their service and returned to civilian life, they would still remember Sarah Martinez. They would tell their own children about the importance of looking beyond surface appearances, about respecting those who have served, and about the danger of assumptions. But, most importantly, they would remember that strength comes in many forms, and that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the one who has the most to teach you. Sarah Martinez continued her reserve service, training new recruits, and passing on the hard-won lessons of her combat experience. She never sought recognition or publicity for her service. She simply continued to serve, quietly and effectively, the way she had always done. In the military, as in life, actions speak louder than words. And Sarah's actions had spoken volumes to 5 young men who learned, perhaps just in time, the importance of looking beyond the surface to see the person underneath. The recruitment center in Phoenix continued to process new recruits every day. The waiting room saw hundreds of young men and women hoping to serve their country, each with their own stories, their own motivations, and their own hidden strengths and weaknesses. But in one corner of that room, 9 young men had learned a lesson they would never forget. And thanks to that lesson, they became better soldiers, better leaders, and better men. The quiet girl had taught them the most important lesson of all: never judge a book by its cover, especially when that book has been written in service to something greater than oneself.